Hi, I'm Katie with Modern Textiles, and today I'm going to go over all the basics of quilting with linen. So I'm actually following my Horizon quilt pattern. I'm using the three-tone colorway, which means I've got two different background fabrics, and then I've got my lines that go horizontally across the quilt. What I'm going to do is, if you stick around, I'll show you the completed quilt, what I chose for quilting, but first things first, let's get into those tips. So I actually went ahead and bought a bunch of linens from Fabulism. I actually got these from, I believe, Fat Quarter Shop, so if you want the links to these types of fabrics, they'll be in the show notes. And I'm going to be sewing up my two-tone, or three-tone if you will, Horizon quilt. So very basic strip piece quilt, and I thought it'd be a great place to start to give just some insider tips or just some tips of quilting with linens. So if you haven't made garments before, things like that, you're just going to want to know a few things before you start quilting up. So the first thing I want to address is always make sure that you pre-wash your linens. They are going to shrink quite a bit more than cotton. So what I did is actually, if you have a serger, this is a great time to break it out. Otherwise, here's my backing fabric. Is I went ahead and just used my zigzag stitch on my other machine. So my Juki only has a straight stitch, but I do have a secondary machine for when this one's getting serviced, and it does have zigzag and like all the extra stitches. So I went ahead and just put in a zigzag stitch on the cut ends of the yardage, and then wash them how I typically wash the quilt itself once it's complete. So that's going to be on cool, delicates, and then I went ahead and tumble dried on cool, low. Otherwise, if you plan on only ever air drying your linen quilt, then more than likely you can just go ahead and toss it onto the line and just let it air dry. So after I did that, I went ahead and really the zigzag stitch helps just make sure it doesn't fray too far down onto the fabric. So I probably kept it within the first ½ inch, and I went as big as I could for stitches. Really, it's just to make sure it doesn't go too wild, which really I think it did a pretty darn good job outside of this little chunk here of keeping the fraying at bay. I then went ahead and just on medium heat ironed, and I went with steam, but I don't really try to stretch out the linen too much, so I just went ahead, ironed out any deep wrinkles on the fabric, and then that way when I went to go ahead and cut my fabric, it was a lot easier, and that way I could be more precise. The next thing you're going to want to take into account is going to be your seam allowance. So the big thing is, if you're able to, if it's not going to mess up with the pattern too much, it's better to have a little bit more than a ¼ inch allowance because of that fraying, okay? So especially if you're washing it, things like that, using it heavily, you're going to want to make sure you go from, instead of a scant ¼ inch, if that's your go-to is just always real tight seams, make sure, try to bump that up to a regular ¼ inch, or even if you've got the room, up to a ½ inch seam allowance is best, and then that way you have no chance of your piecing coming apart down the line. The next thing you're going to want to do is reduce your stitch length on your machine. So the tighter the stitches, it's going to make sure that this is really held together. Your quilt top is going to be held together very well, as well as when you go to quilt, make sure, if you can, choose a denser quilting, and then that way it just keeps that quilt sandwich all together, as well as reinforces your quilt top piecing. And last but not least, if you want to, especially if you've got lots of piecing, say half square triangles, or anything that's going to need trimming, it's best to do a bunch of starch, okay? So starch is going to make sure that you don't distort the linen as you're feeding it through the machine or as you're trimming. It does have a lot more flex. The big thing with linen is that it has a looser weave, which is great. It's nice, light, breathable, especially if it's a quilt you plan on using in the summer months or in hotter temps. It's great quilt for that. I'm probably going to pair mine maybe with bamboo, and then that way it's just a really good breathable summertime quilt that we can use outside. So just to recap, you're going to want to go ahead and pre-wash your quilts. If you can, serge that cut edge, leave it in yardage, serge your cut edge or zigzag stitch just to reduce the amount of fraying. 2, you're going to want to go ahead and just hit that with an iron, get rid of any deep wrinkles. Steam is fine, but just a cooler iron so that way you're not distorting the fabric too much. 3, you're going to want to go ahead and make sure Use starch if you feel that it's necessary. That way you're not distorting the fabric anymore. And then last but not least, making sure to reduce your stitch length. Along with that, we're going to want to make sure that we go ahead and use a denser quilting when you go ahead and either long arm quilt it, or if you're quilting on your own machine, maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch quilting, just to make sure that that sandwich is really held together and it reinforces all of your piecing seams. And the last one, but don't forget it, is if you can increase your seam allowance from a scant or a 1/4 inch on the nose up to maybe a 1/2 inch if it's not going to throw your pattern off. So like for this pattern, being all strip piecing, very simple, it's easy for me to bump my seam allowance as long as I keep it consistent throughout the quilt. Then it'll just reduce the quilt size by a hair and it won't be an issue at all. All right, so through the powers that be of YouTube and video editing, I now have a completed horizon quilt. If only, no, I really like the process of making quilts, so I don't want this to speed up. But for you guys' sake, you didn't have to watch me making this. But as I mentioned, I went with a denser quilting design, and then that way, that's just really going to reinforce all of the seams that I made, as well as just making sure that that sandwich stays nice and together for years to come. Along with that, I did use binding from the cutoff of the backing fabric. So I really wanted to keep everything to be the same. Really, you can mix and match linens, quilting cottons, you name it. To be honest, I've got quilts from my grandma and she used anything that was left over, polyester pants, jeans, you name it, she mixed it all together. They hold up just fine. Just making sure that you wash them on gentle, cool, and then if you can, hang dry them, air dry them, or tumble dry on a cool setting just to make sure that you're really treating them with care the best you can. I did also go ahead, since linens are 100% cotton, I went ahead with a 100% batting. You could go 80-20, anything that's going to allow for a little bit of crinkling, but I've got to say, with all the pre-washing that I've done, it already has that nice drape of a well-used, well-loved quilt. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to make a scrappy snowflake quilt.